Two forestry workers deep inside Germany's Harz Mountains stumble on something that shouldn't be there. A concrete edge poking through the dirt, exposed by a storm that ripped an 80-year-old oak clean out of the ground. They brush away the moss, scrape back the soil, and find a hatch, rusted shut. Sealed for decades, they pry it open, and stale air rushes out like the forest itself has been holding its breath. A narrow concrete staircase drops into total darkness. One of them turns on his phone, light, and what they see down there. It stops them. Cold. A bunker, frozen in time. Military maps pinned to the walls, marked with troop positions from April, 1,945 oil lamps lined up on a shelf, canned rations stacked in rows, a radio set covered in dust, and behind a wooden desk, sitting upright in a chair, a skeleton, still dressed in the remnants of a German officer's uniform, the insignia on the collar barely visible but unmistakable. This was a general. A rusted Luger pistol sits on the desk beside his right hand. No bullet holes, no signs of a struggle. Just silence. 80 years of it. No one had opened this hatch. No one had come looking. No one even knew it was here. Who was this man? Why did he seal himself underground while the world above him burned? And how did a high-ranking German general vanish from history without a single person ever finding him? The answers were buried in that bunker, waiting in the dark for someone to finally come looking. His name was Friedrich Jäger, born 1,897 inches. Kassel, a mid-sized city in central Germany. His father was a schoolteacher, his mother a seamstress. There was no military dynasty, no aristocratic bloodline, no family connections to open doors for him. Everything Friedrich earned, he earned himself. He enlisted at 17 when the First World War broke out, and by 19 he'd been promoted twice on the Western Front. Not because of who he knew, but because of how he thought. While other young officers froze under fire, Friedrich adapted. He read terrain the way a chess player reads, a board calm, precise, always 3 moves ahead by the end of the war. He'd earned an Iron Cross and the respect of men twice his age. Between the wars, he married a woman named Elise, a pianist from Hamburg. Together they had 2 children, a boy named Karl and a girl named Anneliese. They lived in a modest home in Kassel with a garden Elise tended every spring. Friedrich was a quiet father, not cold, but careful with his affection, the kind of man who showed love through presence, not words. When the Second World War began, Friedrich was already a colonel. His reputation as a tactician made him indispensable to the Wehrmacht. He was promoted to general major by 1941, assigned to the Eastern Front, where the fighting was brutal and the stakes were absolute. But here's the thing about Friedrich Jäger. He believed in Germany, not in the party, not in the ideology, in the country, the land, the people, the culture. He served because he believed it was his duty, and for a long time that distinction didn't seem to matter. But it would. It would matter more than anything. By 1941, the Eastern Front had become the largest and most brutal theater of war in human history, and Friedrich Jäger was right in the middle of it. He commanded a division. During Operation Barbarossa, the massive German invasion of the Soviet Union, his units moved fast, hit hard, and adapted to conditions that broke other commanders. The Russian winter, the endless mud, the supply lines that stretched so thin they practically snapped. Friedrich didn't complain. He adjusted. He reorganized his logistics on the fly, rerouted his men through terrain other officers deemed impassable, and when the Soviets counterattacked, he held positions that headquarters had already written off. His peers respected him, his superiors relied on him, and the soldiers under his command would have followed him into anything, because he never asked them to do something he wouldn't do himself by. 1942. He'd been promoted to Generalleutnant and given command of an entire corps on the Eastern Front. His name appeared in Wehrmacht intelligence briefings, not as a political figure, but as a problem solver, the man you sent when a situation was falling apart. But the war was changing, and Friedrich could feel it. The campaigns grew more desperate, the orders more reckless. Entire divisions were being thrown into meat grinders for objectives that made no strategic sense. And behind the front lines, Friedrich began hearing things about what was happening in the occupied territories. Villages emptied train convoys heading east that had nothing to do with military logistics, whispered conversations between SS officers that stopped the moment he walked into a room. Friedrich was a soldier, not a politician, but he wasn't blind. Something dark was growing behind the machinery of war, and for the first time in his career, the line between duty and conscience began to blur. By 1943, the tide had turned. Stalingrad had fallen, the Afrika Korps was finished, and the Allies were pushing into Italy. The war Friedrich had believed in the defense of his homeland was becoming something else, entirely an ideological death spiral, and the orders coming down from Berlin proved it. Friedrich received a directive to support operations that had nothing to do with military strategy: the forced relocation of civilian populations, the destruction of entire villages. As collective punishment, the execution of prisoners who could have provided valuable intelligence. He carried out some of those orders, delayed others, and quietly buried a few, entirely hoping no one would notice, but people always notice. In the summer of 1944, a group of Wehrmacht officers attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler. The July 20th plot, a bomb detonated at the Wolf's Lair, but Hitler survived. The purge that followed was savage. Thousands were arrested, interrogated, executed. Friedrich wasn't directly involved, but his name surfaced in the wrong conversations. He'd dined with Klaus von Stauffenberg months before the attempt he'd been seen speaking. Privately. With other conspirators at a staff meeting in Berlin, the Gestapo came to question him twice. The first time was polite, almost casual. The second time wasn't. Friedrich gave them nothing because there was nothing concrete to give, but he understood what those visits meant. He was on a list, maybe not at the top, but lists have a way of getting shorter. He was transferred away from the Eastern Front, officially, a lateral move to a defensive command in central Germany. Unofficially, it was exile. The message was clear: we're watching you. Friedrich Jaeger had spent his entire career earning trust, and in a single summer it had evaporated. He was a general without allies, a soldier whose loyalty was now questioned by the very regime he served. And the war wasn't over. Not yet. The worst was still coming. By April 1945, Germany was dying. The Soviets were grinding through the eastern suburbs of Berlin. The Americans and British had crossed the Rhine and were pushing deep into the heartland. Cities that had stood for centuries were being reduced to rubble in hours, and the orders coming from the Führer bunker had lost all connection to reality. Hold at all costs. Fight to the last man. No retreat, no surrender. Friedrich Jaeger was commanding what was left of a defensive line. Near the Harz Mountains, a patchwork of exhausted veterans. Teenage conscripts and old men handed rifles. They barely knew how to fire. On April 11th, he received orders from Berlin to hold his position against an advancing American armored division. The message was clear: stand and die. Friedrich looked at the men around him, boys with hollow eyes, grandfathers shaking in uniforms that didn't fit, and he made a decision that night. He stayed late at his field headquarters, requisitioned farmhouse near Nordhausen. His staff saw him studying maps, burning papers, making notes in a leather-bound journal. Nothing unusual for a general preparing for the next day's defense. But when his adjutant arrived at dawn on April 12th, the quarters were empty. Friedrich's cot was made. His desk cleared. His personal sidearm, a Luger P8 he'd carried since 1918, was gone. So was a leather satchel he kept locked in a footlocker containing documents no one else had ever been permitted to see. No note, no instructions, no explanation. The maps on the wall were still pinned in place. His reading glasses sat folded on the desk. His boots, the spare pair, were still by the door. It was as if he'd simply stood up, walked out, and dissolved into the night. Friedrich Jaeger was gone. His adjutant reported him missing within hours. But here's the thing about April. 1,945 inches, Germany. Nobody was looking for one missing general. The entire country was collapsing. Communication lines were severed, command structures had disintegrated, and thousands of soldiers were deserting, surrendering, or dying every single day. Friedrich's disappearance barely registered. His staff assumed the worst: a stray artillery shell, a sniper, a bombing raid that left nothing to recover. It happened constantly in those final weeks. One officer was alive in the morning and simply gone by nightfall. No body, no explanation, just another name swallowed by the chaos. But others had different theories. His chief of staff, a man named Werner Brandt, quietly told colleagues he believed Friedrich had defected, crossed the American lines, and surrendered in exchange for intelligence. Some whispered he'd gone south toward the Alpine Redoubt, the mythical Nazi fortress in the Bavarian Alps, where die-hard loyalists were supposedly gathering for a last stand. But Friedrich had never been a loyalist, not to the regime, and those who knew him understood that after the war, Allied intelligence agencies compiled massive lists of German officers captured, surrendered, killed, or wanted. Friedrich Jaeger appeared on none of them. The Americans didn't have him. The British didn't have him. The Soviets didn't have him. His name showed up on no prisoner rosters, no hospital records, no death certificates, no war crimes tribunals. His wife, Elise, still in Kassel, received no telegram, no official notification, no visit from a chaplain. She wrote letters to the Red Cross, to the Allied military government, to anyone who might know something. The replies were always the same. We have no record of this individual. Friedrich Jaeger hadn't died, hadn't surrendered, hadn't defected. He had simply ceased to exist, as if the war had erased him completely. Elise Jaeger survived the war, but what she lived through afterward was its own kind of destruction. Kassel had been bombed nearly flat. Over 80% of the city center was gone. Their modest home with the garden she'd tended every spring was rubble. She and the children, Karl, now 14, and Anneliese, just 11, moved in with relatives in a village outside the city and waited for news that never came in. The months after the surrender, Elise wrote letters, dozens of them, to the Red Cross, to the Allied military government in Hesse, to former Wehrmacht officers who'd served with Friedrich, to anyone whose name she could remember from dinner parties and military functions. The replies, when they came at all, said the same thing. No record of Friedrich Jaeger among the living or the dead. In 1946, American intelligence briefly opened a file on Friedrich as part of their denazification investigations. His name had appeared in connection with certain Eastern Front operations, and there were questions about his knowledge of activities behind the lines. But the inquiry went nowhere. His record was ambiguous, not clean enough to ignore, but not damning enough to pursue. The file was closed within months, marked inconclusive. Elise kept writing, kept asking, kept hoping. Carl grew up angry at a father who had abandoned them. Annalise grew up sad for a father she believed had died trying to protect them. The two children carried the same absence, but it shaped them in completely different ways. In 1953, Elise filed the paperwork to have Friedrich declared legally dead. It was a requirement for the pension she desperately needed to survive, but she never believed it. Not really. She kept his study intact in their rebuilt home, his books on the shelf, his reading glasses in the desk drawer, his coat hanging by the door, as if he might walk back in any evening and ask what was for dinner. She maintained that room for 30 years until she died in 1984, still waiting, still not knowing the woman who had married. A soldier spent her entire life married to a ghost. The decades did what decades do. They buried things. Friedrich Jaeger became a footnote, a minor curiosity in the vast catalog of World War II's unresolved disappearances, but every few years his name would surface in the strangest places. In 1958, a West German intelligence report flagged an unconfirmed sighting of a man matching Friedrich's description in Buenos Aires, Argentina, a city already infamous as a haven for former Nazi officers. The report was filed but never investigated. In 1963, a defecting Soviet intelligence officer told his CIA handlers that the Soviets had recruited several missing Wehrmacht generals in the final days of the war. He couldn't remember specific names but described a tactician from central Germany who had been offered a new identity in exchange for strategic consultation. The CIA cross-referenced the description with their files. Friedrich Jaeger was among 6 possible matches, but without confirmation, the lead died quietly in a filing cabinet in Langley. Then, in the 1970s, a historian researching Wehrmacht command structures for an academic publication stumbled across Friedrich's service record. The man's career was impressive, his disappearance puzzling, but the historian devoted only a single paragraph to him, noting that several dozen senior officers had vanished in the final weeks of the war, and that most were presumed dead in unrecorded engagements. Friedrich Jaeger became exactly what the chaos of 1945 produced: a man without an ending. No grave, no trial, no confession, no dramatic escape, just a name on a list of people who were there one day and gone the next, and that's where it stayed. For decades, a question nobody was asking anymore, a mystery nobody was trying to solve. The world had moved on. There were new wars, new crises, new reasons to forget. And somewhere, deep beneath the roots and moss of a German forest, a bunker sat sealed and silent, holding an answer that no one was looking for. The Harz Mountains sit in the heart of gay Armenia, a region where the ancient and the modern have never quite learned to coexist. The forest that blankets those mountains is dense, dark, and old. Some of the trees have stood for centuries, their canopies so thick that sunlight barely reaches the forest floor. In places, it feels prehistoric, like the land itself has been holding its breath since long before anyone thought to build a country on top of it. But beneath that quiet surface, the Harz has a violent history during the Second World War. The Wehrmacht used these mountains extensively for training exercises, ammunition, storage, and underground manufacturing. The Nazis built tunnel complexes beneath the ridgelines, some for weapons production, others for purposes that were never fully documented. After the war, the region fell behind the Iron Curtain. East German authorities sealed what they could find, fenced off the rest, and told people to stay away after reunification in 1990. The German government cataloged some of the old military sites, but the forest was vast and the budget was not. Surveys were incomplete, entire sections of the mountains were never properly searched, and the forest did what forests do. It grew over everything. Locals in the surrounding villages know the stories. Hunters who've come across rusted helmets, half buried in the undergrowth mushroom foragers, who've stepped through rotten timbers into collapsed tunnels. A schoolteacher in Braunlage claims he found a crate of degraded ammunition in the 1990s and simply covered it back up because he didn't want the trouble. Every few years, someone finds something, a crumbling CAT, concrete wall, a section of barbed wire woven into the roots of a tree. The remnants of a structure that doesn't appear on any map, the authorities are called forms, are filed, and nothing much happens, because there's always more. The HARS holds what it takes, and it doesn't give things back easily. 80 years of growth, decay, and silence had turned these mountains into a graveyard of secrets. Most of them small, most of them forgotten, but not all of them. March 2025. Two forestry workers named Lucas Meyer and Stefan Voss are conducting a routine survey in a remote section of the Harz near the old mining town of Klostel-Zellerfeld. A massive storm had torn through the region 2 weeks earlier, toppling dozens of old-growth trees and reshaping the landscape in ways that made their existing maps nearly useless. Lucas is 34, meticulous, the kind of person who documents everything with photographs and notes. Stefan is 28, newer to the job, more impulsive, the one who wanders off the path because something caught his eye. It was Stefan who noticed it first, a chunk of concrete jutting from the earth where the root system of a fallen spruce had been ripped from the ground. At first they assumed it was a fragment of an old foundation, maybe a forester's hut or a wartime storage building, but as they cleared away the soil and debris, the shape became unmistakable. A hatch, rectangular metal, reinforced, set into a concrete frame. The hinges were completely seized, rusted into a solid mass. The surface was covered in decades of moss and compacted dirt. This hadn't been opened in a very long time. It took them 20 minutes, with a pry bar and a lot of swearing before the hatch finally gave way. The sound it made was something neither of them would forget, a deep groan of metal separating from concrete, followed by a rush of air, cold, stale air that smelled like damp earth and something else. Something faintly chemical like old fuel or preservative. Lucas pointed his flashlight into the opening below them. A narrow concrete staircase descended into darkness. The beam caught dust particles swirling in. Air that hadn't moved in 80 years. Stefan looked at Lucas. Lucas looked at the stairs. And then they went down, step by careful step, into a place the world had completely forgotten. The flashlight beam cut through darkness that hadn't been disturbed in 8 decades. The staircase was short, maybe 12 steps down, and then they were standing in a single rectangular room, no larger than a modest bedroom. The ceiling was low enough that Stefan had to duck slightly, and the walls were bare, concrete, damp in places, cracked in others, but structurally intact. Whatever had built this place had built it to last. And here's what makes it so unsettling. Everything was organized meticulously, deliberately, as if the person who lived here had prepared for a very long stay against the left wall. A narrow military cot with a wool blanket folded at its foot. The fabric had deteriorated, but you could still see the fold lines, crisp and intentional. Beside the cot, a pair of boots placed side by side along the back wall. Wooden shelves lined with canned provisions, dozens of them, all German military rations, all long expired, the labels. Faded, but still partially legible next to the rations. Metal water containers, 5 of them stacked neatly. A radio set sat on a smaller shelf, its dials frozen in position, wires running to an antenna cable that disappeared into the ceiling. Whoever was down here had tried to maintain contact with the outside world. On the right wall maps, 3 of them pinned directly into the concrete, with small nails. They showed troop positions, supply lines, and defensive coordinates, all dated April 1945, the final days. And then there was the desk pushed against the far wall. A simple wooden field desk, military issue. On its surface, a leather satchel buckled shut, a pair of reading glasses folded neatly, an oil lamp, and a Luger P8 pistol, rusted but unmistakable, sitting beside the right hand of the man who still occupied the chair. The skeleton sat upright, slightly slumped forward, as if he had fallen asleep at his desk. The uniform had largely disintegrated, but the collar insignia were still identifiable. The rank of a general lieutenant, no bullet wound, no shattered bone, no sign of violence, just a man who had sat down at his desk and never stood up again. Lucas and Stefan didn't touch anything. They climbed back up, sealed the area as best they could, and called the authorities within 24 hours. The site was cordoned off by state police and a team that nobody in the nearby villages had ever seen before arrived. Forensic specialists, military archaeologists, historians from the Bundeswehr Center of Military History in Potsdam, and a quiet man from the Federal Archives in Berlin who carried a briefcase and spoke to no one. The bunker was treated as both a crime scene and a historical site. Every item was photographed, catalogued, and carefully removed. The skeleton was transported to a forensic laboratory in Göttingen, where the real work began. Dental records were compared against Wehrmacht personnel files that had survived the war. DNA was extracted from bone fragments and cross-referenced with genealogical databases. The uniform analysis confirmed the rank General Leutnant, the style, and manufacturing marks dated it to 1943 or 1944, consistent with late war officer issue, but it was the leather satchel that broke the case. Open inside were documents that had been sealed for 80 years, orders from Berlin, dated April 1945, directing the general to hold his position at all costs, stamped with the eagle and swastika of the Wehrmacht High Command beside them. A handwritten note, in the same ink, the same hand. 3 words, Ich kann nicht, I cannot. Beneath the orders were personal letters, 4 of them addressed to Elise, to Karl, to Anneliese, and one with no name on the envelope. None of them had ever been sent, and at the bottom of the satchel wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, a leather-bound journal. The entries began on April 12, 1945. The night Friedrich Jaeger disappeared, and what he wrote in those pages would finally explain not just where he went, but why. This story was brutal. But this story on the right-hand side about the German general is even more insane.